My name is Emma Hart. I am 29 years old and I work as an emergency room nurse in a small hospital in Colorado. Life is not glamorous, but it is honest. I live in a modest two-bedroom house on the edge of town with my 15-year-old daughter, Sophie, who is my entire world. Sophie is the kind of teenager any parent would be proud of. She is bright, responsible, and kind to everyone she meets. She plays the guitar volunteers at the animal shelter and somehow still manages to keep straight A's. We have been through a lot together and we have always been a team. That is why when the ivory envelope arrived in the mail one crisp November afternoon, my heart swelled with excitement. It was from my older sister, Olivia. She was getting married to Ethan Wallace, a high-profile attorney from Denver, and I had been expecting the invitation for months. Sophie was already talking about what she might wear, maybe even doing her hair up for the first time. She adored her Aunt Olivia, who used to spend entire afternoons baking cookies with her or taking her to the park. We tore the envelope open together at the kitchen counter. Thick cardstock with gold-embossed lettering spilled into my hands. I scanned the formal script. It was everything you would expect from a high-society wedding. The Grand Peaks Hotel, black tie attire, champagne reception. I smiled until I saw the line near the bottom that stopped me cold Emma Hart and guessed. No mention of Sophie. My stomach tightened. I read it twice, 3 times, hoping I had missed something. Sophie leaned over my shoulder. Her eyes darted to the line where her name should have been. She froze. "Is it just a mistake?" she asked, her voice hopeful. I could feel her eyes on me. I called Olivia right away. She picked up on the second ring, her tone brisk, like she was already in the middle of something important. "Hey, Em," she said. "Did you get the invitation?" I asked her why Sophie's name was not on it. There was a pause, and then she said the words that would light the fire in my chest. "Oh, right. The wedding is adults only. No one under 18. I kept my voice steady, but I felt a surge of disbelief. "She is 15, Olivia. She is your niece. She is more mature than half the adults I know. This has nothing to do with maturity," Olivia interrupted. "It is about the atmosphere. Ethan and I want a certain tone for our wedding. No kids running around. We need everyone to look polished, sophisticated. You understand." I pictured Sophie's face the way she had been so excited about picking out a dress. My voice dropped. "She is not a child running around, Olivia. She is family." Olivia's sigh was almost theatrical. "Look, it is not personal. We just cannot make exceptions. Ethan's family is very traditional about these things." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. "You mean they think she does not fit the image you want to present?" There was silence on the other end. Then Olivia said quietly, "I am sorry you feel that way." I hung up before I said something I could not take back. When I turned, Sophie was standing in the doorway clutching the sleeve of her sweater. "Did she say I am not invited?" She asked it so simply that it broke me. "Yes," I said, and I watched her expression crumble. She nodded once as if she had expected it. "It is fine," she whispered. I probably would have been bored anyway, but I knew it was not fine. I knew that deep down she was asking herself the question I had asked my entire childhood. Why am I not enough for my own family? In that moment, I made a silent promise. I would not let Sophie be treated as less than by anyone, not even by her own aunt, especially not by her own aunt. And whatever it took, I would make sure they understood exactly what it cost to exclude my daughter. I wish I could say this was the first time someone in my family had made Sophie feel like she did not belong, but it was not. To understand why this wedding invitation cut so deep, you have to know where I come from. I grew up in a house where love was conditional, and survival meant keeping your head down. My father was a big man with a booming voice and a temper that could turn a room cold in an instant. He never hit Olivia. She was his golden child, his pride and joy. But me, I was the one who got the belt across my legs when I spoke out of turn. The one who heard words like useless and ungrateful spat in my direction. My mother, Marianne, was the kind of woman who believed family reputation came before everything. She covered the bruises on my arms with long sleeves, told me to smile at family dinners, and whispered "be good" in my ear when she saw my father's jaw tighten. Olivia and I were close once when we were little. She would sneak into my room after a fight and tell me jokes to make me laugh. She promised she would always be on my side. But by the time she was in high school, she had learned how to keep Dad happy, agree with him, praise him, and never question his decisions. She became his perfect daughter, and I became the one who made trouble. When I left home at 18, I swore I would never let that dynamic repeat itself. I worked my way through nursing school, picked up night shifts and extra hours. And when Sophie was born, I promised her something I never got: unconditional acceptance. I wanted her to know that she was enough exactly as she was. That is why the wedding mattered more than Olivia could ever understand. It was not just an invitation to a fancy party. It was a symbol. It was a chance for Sophie to be part of the family in a visible, undeniable way. And now that chance was being taken away, with a polite adults-only policy that was nothing more than a shield for their prejudice. The stakes could not be higher. If I let this slide, what message would I be sending Sophie? That her place in this family is negotiable, that she has to earn her seat at the table, that people can erase her from important moments, and she just has to smile and accept it. I saw what that did to me. I saw how years of being the expendable one twisted my self-worth into something brittle and small. It took me most of my 20s to rebuild myself into someone who believed she deserved love and respect. I was not about to let my daughter go through that same slow erosion. But it was not just about Sophie's feelings. Olivia's decision tapped into every scar I carried from childhood. Every holiday where I sat at the far end of the table while Olivia was in the seat of honor. Every birthday where my gift was an afterthought while hers was extravagant. Every time my father told me I was lucky to have a roof over my head while Olivia was praised for her accomplishments. I thought we had left that behind. I thought we had grown into adults who could see past old roles and treat each other as equals. But this was proof that, for Olivia, some things had not changed. She was still the one who got invited in, and I was still the one left at the door. And now she was extending that exclusion to my child. I sat at our kitchen table that night. After Sophie went to bed, the invitation in front of me, like an accusation. I imagined Sophie sitting in her room, pretending not to care, and it made my chest ache. This was more than a slight. This was a test. And the cost of failing it would not just be one night in June. It would be the slow, silent acceptance of a pattern that would tell my daughter her value could be diminished by the people who should love her most. I could not let that happen. Not again. Not ever. Olivia had not always been like this. When we were young, she was the person I trusted most, the one who slipped me extra cookies when Dad was in one of his moods, the one who whispered to me that we would get out of that house someday and make our own rules. But something shifted after she went away to college. She came back during her junior year with a new wardrobe, new friends, and a way of talking that made me feel like I was standing on the wrong side of an invisible line. When she met Ethan Wallace at a charity fundraiser during her final year, I thought he was just another boyfriend who would fade away. He was polished and charming, in that rehearsed kind of way, the kind that made older relatives nod approvingly. His family was old Denver money, with a reputation for keeping their social circles small and exclusive. I noticed the change almost immediately after they got serious. Olivia stopped visiting me and Sophie on weekends. The casual dinners at my place were replaced by excuses about Ethan's work schedule or events they had to attend. She started posting pictures of herself at wine tastings, ski resorts, and formal galas, always in designer dresses I knew cost more than my monthly rent. And then there was Margaret Wallace, Ethan's mother. The first time I met her, she looked me up and down with the kind of smile that was more about showing teeth than warmth. She asked me how long I had been in nursing school, even though I had graduated years earlier. When I told her I worked in the ER, she nodded like she was humoring me, then launched into a story about her charity work for underprivileged children, glancing at Sophie in a way that made my skin prickle. It became clear that Margaret saw people in two categories: those who enhanced her image and those who did not. Sophie and I were firmly in the latter. Olivia never confronted Margaret about it. If anything, she seemed eager to smooth over any awkwardness, to prove she could fit seamlessly into their world. That meant distancing herself from anything that might be considered ordinary or, in their terms, unsophisticated. Last year, Sophie was left off the guest list for Olivia's stepdaughter's Sweet 16 party. Olivia told me it was a small event, but later I saw pictures online with over 50 guests, including distant cousins. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying Sophie wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway. That was the beginning of a pattern. Birthdays, holidays, even casual family get-togethers at Olivia's house seemed to have invisible restrictions when it came to Sophie and me. My mother never said anything against Olivia. If anything, she encouraged me to understand her position because Ethan's job and family connections had already been helpful to us. Apparently, he had gotten my cousin out of a legal mess the year before. The message was clear: Olivia's marriage brought benefits to the family, and no one wanted to jeopardize that. It was the same hierarchy we had grown up with, just dressed in more expensive clothes. Olivia in the favored position, me expected to accept whatever scraps of inclusion were offered. But this time the stakes were higher because it wasn't just about me. Sophie was starting to notice. She had once adored her aunt, rushing to show her every new drawing or school project. Now she kept her distance, her excitement dimming each time another event passed without an invitation. I had worked so hard to give Sophie a safe, loving environment, but the slow drip of exclusion was threatening to undo that. I could feel the old resentment from my childhood resurfacing sharper now, because I could see the same hurt in my daughter's eyes. The people who should have been her biggest supporters were turning into the very source of her doubt, and I knew if I didn't step in, no one else would. After the phone call with Olivia, I sent my RSVP declining the invitation. No explanation, no argument, just a simple not attending. I knew it would not end there. The first text came from my mother the next morning. "Are you really skipping your sister's wedding over this age thing?" she wrote, as if Sophie's exclusion was a minor inconvenience. When I did not answer, my phone started buzzing with calls from cousins and aunts. Some were curious, some judgmental, but all carried the same undertone: I was the one causing trouble. Then Sophie overheard something that shifted the entire situation from hurtful to infuriating. She had come downstairs quietly to grab a snack and caught me on the phone with my mother. I was asking her to explain why Ethan's 16-year-old nephew was on the guest list if the rule was no one under 18. My mother's voice grew tight. "That is different," she said. "He is family." Sophie froze in the doorway. I saw her eyes widen before she turned and went back upstairs. Later, she told me what she had also overheard before I noticed her. Olivia had told my mother that Sophie would not fit in at the wedding. She used those exact words. "She will stand out for the wrong reasons. She is not polished enough." Hearing that broke something in Sophie. She stopped talking about her art, stopped practicing her guitar. She deleted the Pinterest board she had been filling with dress ideas for the wedding. I tried to reassure her, but I could see the message had landed deep. Meanwhile, my mother doubled down. She called again, telling me I needed to put aside my pride and show up for the family. If Sophie could not come, I should find a babysitter. "It's just one day," she kept repeating. But I knew it was not just one day. It was the continuation of a lifetime of being told to take the smaller share, to smile and say thank you for less than I deserved. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This was not about rules or logistics. It was about image. Ethan and his family had a very clear picture of what their wedding should look like, and Sophie did not fit it. The so-called adults-only policy was just a polite veneer for something uglier. I needed proof, something undeniable. That proof came from an unexpected source. One of the nurses I worked with had a sister employed at the Grand Peaks Hotel, where the wedding was being held. She mentioned in passing that she had seen the guest list. When I asked if she remembered the names, she nodded and said she was sure there was a teenager on it. She even managed to discreetly snap a photo of the list. There it was in black and white, Ethan's 16-year-old nephew listed with his parents. The hypocrisy was laid out plain as day. I forwarded the image to my phone and stared at it, my pulse racing. Now I knew the truth for certain. This was not a rule being applied evenly. This was a targeted exclusion. When I confronted Olivia with the evidence, she did not deny it. Instead, Ethan's voice came over speakerphone. "We have to be selective," he said smoothly. "Not everyone enhances the event." That was all it took for the memories of my childhood to come flooding back. The dinner tables where I sat in silence while Olivia was praised the holidays where I was expected to be grateful for whatever attention I got. I realized I had been cast in that same role again, and now they were doing it to Sophie. I ended the call without another word. I could feel something shifting inside me. This was no longer just about whether we attended a wedding. It was about drawing a line that could not be crossed again. The night after that call, I sat in the dim light of the living room, the photo of the guest list open on my phone, and felt the weight of every insult, every dismissal, every moment my daughter had been treated like she was less. The air in the house felt heavy, as if the past had crept in through the walls. I thought of Sophie upstairs pretending to do homework when I knew she was scrolling through old pictures of her and Olivia. She had looked up to her aunt for so long, seeing her as a glamorous, confident woman who still loved her despite the distance. Now that image was cracked in half. The confirmation that Ethan's nephew was invited proved everything I had suspected. The adults-only rule was nothing but a shield for selective inclusion. And Sophie had been purposefully excluded. I knew confronting Olivia again in the same way would lead nowhere. She was in too deep with Ethan and his family, too invested in maintaining the image they had built together. The humiliation of that phone call sat in my chest like a stone. I needed to change my approach. At work the next day during a break, I pulled out a notebook and began to write down everything I remembered. The birthdays Sophie had been left out of the way. Margaret had spoken to her at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. The excuses Olivia had given that never quite made sense. I added dates, places, even who else was there. It was meticulous, almost like charting a patient's history. It felt clinical at first, but the more I wrote, the more I realized this was not just documentation. This was a record of a pattern. That evening, I talked to Sophie, careful to keep my voice calm. I told her I had proof the rule was not applied to everyone, and I watched her eyes flicker between relief and sadness. "So it was on purpose," she said quietly. I nodded. She looked down at her hands. Why, though? I shrugged, because the truth was both simple and devastating. Some people value appearances more than they value people. Sophie was silent for a long moment before she asked, "What are we going to do?" I felt the shift then. She had said we, not you, not me. We. This was our stand together. I told her we were not going to the wedding, but that did not mean we were doing nothing. I was not going to confront Olivia now when she could brush me off or twist my words. I wanted to wait until the moment would have the most impact. That moment would be Christmas. Every year my mother hosted Christmas Eve dinner. Everyone came, no matter the grudges or tensions. It was the one time of year the whole family sat under the same roof. I would be there, and so would Olivia, Ethan, and Margaret. I decided I would bring them a gift. Not something expensive, not something they could dismiss as tacky or inappropriate. Something they would have to look at page by page with the rest of the family watching. I began gathering photos that night. Old ones, of Olivia and me as kids, of us holding Sophie when she was a baby, of birthdays and holidays, when Olivia had been present and loving. Then I added the more recent moments of absence, a picture of Sophie at her art show standing in front of a painting she had hoped Olivia would see but did not, a shot of her empty chair at last year's Thanksgiving table. Between the photos, I slid copies of texts where excuses were made, and finally the image of the wedding guest list with Ethan's nephew's name. By the time I was done, it was a timeline and an indictment wrapped in one. I put it all into a leather-bound album, the kind that looked more like a keepsake than a weapon. On the last page in my handwriting, I wrote, "Family means no one gets left behind." I closed it and placed it in a box, tied it with a ribbon, and set it aside for Christmas Eve. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the tension in the family rippled outward like cracks in ice. Word of my refusal to attend the wedding had already made its way through the grapevine, but now there was a new layer of speculation. A cousin messaged me late one night saying she had overheard Margaret at a holiday luncheon, telling another guest that she had to be careful about who you let into certain events, and that some relatives can be embarrassing without realizing it. I knew exactly who she meant. The same cousin also told me that Margaret had been quietly influencing my mother, insisting that it was better to keep Sophie away from environments she wouldn't understand. The hypocrisy burned, especially knowing they had no problem including Ethan's nephew. At work, I found it hard to focus. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced for another message from a relative telling me to be the bigger person or to let it go for the sake of peace. Some were blunt, accusing me of being jealous of Olivia's life, as if wanting your child to be treated with basic respect was envy. The worst was a Facebook comment from a distant aunt I barely spoke to. Under one of Sophie's art posts, she wrote, "You're lucky to have what you have. Don't forget who gave you a home." Sophie saw it before I could delete it. She asked me if that meant what she thought it meant. I told her no, but I could see the doubt forming. That night, she barely ate, retreating to her room without finishing the movie we had planned to watch. I started saving screenshots of every comment and message, not because I planned to use them immediately, but because I had learned the hard way that people's memories get very selective when confronted. A friend of mine, a lawyer, told me to keep everything in case it escalated into defamation. He also reminded me that sometimes the best move was to let people dig their own holes. I thought about that as I finished wrapping the album. I had no intention of starting a screaming match at Christmas. I didn't need to. I just needed to hand over the gift and let the truth sit in the middle of the room, impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Sophie was quieter than usual. But I noticed she had started sketching again, small drawings in the margins of her notebooks. It was a sign that she was finding her footing despite the storm around us. Still, the damage was done. This wasn't just about one event anymore. It was about a whole network of people deciding whose presence had value and whose didn't, and Sophie was on the wrong side of that line. As Christmas Eve approached, I knew the moment was coming when all of them would be in one room. They thought they were walking into a night of polite conversation and holiday cheer. They had no idea what I was bringing with me. Christmas Eve arrived with a thin layer of snow covering the streets, the kind that made everything look picture perfect if you didn't know what was brewing underneath. Sophie and I spent the morning baking gingerbread cookies, the smell filling the kitchen, like it had every year since she was old enough to stand on a stool and stir the dough. She wore the green sweater her grandmother had given her last year, the one she only put on for holidays. I watched her carefully, looking for signs of the anxiety I knew she felt. But she was composed, almost too composed, like she had put on her own kind of armor. The album sat in a plain white gift bag between our coats, wrapped in tissue paper, looking innocent. I didn't tell Sophie exactly what was inside. All I said was that it was something for Aunt Olivia, something that might make her remember who she used to be. When we arrived at my mother's house, the usual chaos of a family holiday was in full swing. Laughter from the kitchen, the clink of glasses, the smell of roast beef and cinnamon. But underneath it, I felt the shift in the air when people noticed us. Conversations paused for a beat, eyes flicked toward me, then away. I kept my chin high and guided Sophie into the living room where Olivia stood by the fireplace with Ethan and Margaret. Olivia looked flawless in a deep red dress, hair perfectly styled, the picture of a society wife. She greeted me with a quick hug, then looked at Sophie and said, "You've grown so much," like she was talking to a neighbor's kid instead of her own niece. Sophie smiled politely and said, "Merry Christmas." Margaret gave us both a nod, her eyes scanning us like we were items on a list she wasn't sure belonged. We made it through dinner with minimal conversation. Sophie and I were seated at the far end of the table, away from Olivia and Ethan, close enough to the kitchen that we were almost in another room. I watched my mother fuss over Margaret, watched Ethan talk about a new client, watched Olivia laugh a little too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. I kept my expression neutral, my attention on Sophie, who pushed food around her plate but stayed composed. After dessert, it was time for gifts. We always went around in a circle, each person opening one, while the rest watched. My heart rate picked up as the moment approached. Finally, it was Olivia's turn. I handed her the bag, my voice calm. "This is from Sophie and me." She slid the album out, her expression curious, then opened the cover. The first page was a photo of her as a baby, swaddled in a blanket in my 5-year-old arms. As she turned the pages, the room grew quieter. Pictures of us as children, birthdays, summer vacations, her holding Sophie in the hospital, Sophie's first day of school. Then came the photos of empty chairs, events missed, Sophie at her art show alone, the text messages with excuses. I watched her hands pause on the image of the wedding guest list with Ethan's nephew's name clearly visible. Her eyes flicked up to mine, then back to the page. On the last page, she read the words I had written. "Family means no one gets left behind." No one spoke. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, clearly irritated. Ethan's jaw tightened. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked finally, his tone sharp. "The truth," I said simply. "A record." Olivia closed the album slowly, her eyes glistening. Before she could speak, Ethan jumped in. "This is inappropriate. Bringing something like this here is manipulative. You're trying to make a scene." I didn't raise my voice. I just said, if the truth makes a scene, maybe the problem isn't the truth. Across the room, one of my uncles cleared his throat. "I think we should hear what Olivia has to say." Margaret scoffed. "There's nothing to say. Not everyone fits every occasion. That's just life." Sophie's face went pale, but she stayed silent. Then Olivia did something I didn't expect. She turned to Margaret and said, "Actually, I think there is something to say." Her voice was quiet but steady. "This is my niece. I love her. And I let people make me believe she didn't belong." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan muttered something under his breath, but Olivia ignored him. She looked at Sophie. "I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you." I could see Ethan stiffen beside her, but she didn't back down. That moment, small as it was the first crack in the wall that had been built between us. I hadn't expected a full collapse, not yet. But I had brought the truth into the room, and now it was sitting there in front of everyone, impossible to unsee. The days after Christmas moved quickly, and for the first time in years, the family group chat was alive with something other than holiday recipes and vacation photos. The album had stirred up more than awkward glances. My cousin Daniel, who had always stayed neutral, messaged me privately to say that after seeing the wedding guest list photo, he confronted Ethan about the double standard. Ethan apparently tried to brush it off, but the story began to spread beyond the family. One of my uncles, who worked in local media, hinted to me that Ethan's name was now being quietly discussed in circles he would rather keep clean. The hypocrisy of a man who built his reputation on fairness and integrity, while openly applying different standards to his own family, was too juicy to ignore. Within a week, Olivia called me, her voice tight. She said Ethan had lost a potential high-profile client after word of the incident reached them. They didn't want to be associated with someone whose own relatives accused him of discrimination. I didn't feel sorry. Actions have consequences, and Ethan had brought this on himself. Margaret, however, was not one to take a blow quietly. She began calling my mother daily, blaming me for sabotaging her son's career. My mother, torn between defending me and maintaining her relationship with Olivia, finally admitted she had no idea the guest list exception had existed. When I sent her the photo, she went silent for a long time before saying, "I should have believed you from the start." Meanwhile, Sophie had her own small victory. The aunt who had left the cruel comment on her art post publicly apologized, posting a new comment saying she had spoken out of turn and admired Sophie's resilience. It wasn't much, but Sophie smiled when she saw it, and I could tell it mattered to her. Then came the real blow for Ethan and Margaret. A client of Margaret's charity organization withdrew a substantial donation after hearing how Sophie had been excluded. The donor's granddaughter was adopted, and when she heard the story, she told her grandmother she couldn't support a cause led by someone who treated adopted family members as less. Margaret's fury was volcanic, but there was nothing she could do to spin it. Olivia, caught between her husband and the fallout, started reaching out more texts to check on Sophie's small attempts to rebuild trust. I kept my responses polite but measured. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure the line I had drawn stayed clear. The damage to Ethan's pristine image was done, and the quiet judgment from our extended family toward him and Margaret was not going away anytime soon. For once, the people who had made Sophie feel small were the ones shrinking under the weight of scrutiny. In the weeks after Christmas, Sophie carried herself differently. It was subtle at first, her shoulders less slouched, her eye contact steadier. But I noticed. She started talking more about her art again, sharing sketches with me without waiting for my prompting. One afternoon, she came into the kitchen with a grin I hadn't seen in months and said, "Mom, I submitted one of my paintings to the local gallery student showcase." I didn't care whether she was chosen. The fact that she felt her work was worth sharing was already the win. The gallery called a week later. Not only had they accepted her painting, they wanted it displayed in the front window. On the night of the opening, she wore the same dress she had planned for Olivia's wedding, no longer a symbol of rejection, but of resilience. As we walked into the gallery, heads turned. My daughter, radiant under the soft lighting, stood in front of her painting while strangers admired it and asked her questions. At one point, I overheard her telling a curious older couple, "It's about finding your place, even when people try to tell you you don't belong." She didn't flinch or soften the truth. She owned it. That night, Olivia arrived. She slipped in quietly without Ethan or Margaret holding a small bouquet of white tulips. She approached Sophie and handed her the flowers. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I should have fought for you." Sophie looked at her for a long moment, then took the flowers. "Thank you." That was all. Forgiveness wouldn't come in a single moment, but this was a start. Later, Olivia pulled me aside. "I'm separating from Ethan." The words were so unexpected that I just stared at her. "I can't keep living in a way that makes me lose the people who matter most." The wedding, the Christmas album, it all made me realize how far I'd let things go. I asked if she was sure. She nodded. "I've already found a place for myself. It's small, but it's mine. And I want Sophie to visit. She deserves to be part of my life again." There was a sincerity in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Over the next month, Sophie started spending Saturday afternoons with Olivia again. They baked, they painted, they went to the park, slowly rebuilding something that had nearly been destroyed. One evening, after Sophie returned from one of those visits, she curled up next to me on the couch. "Mom, you know how at the wedding I would have felt like I didn't belong?" she asked. I nodded. "Well, I think maybe now I would have. Because I know I do. The tears in my eyes weren't from sadness, they were from pride." Sophie had learned the most important truth I could have hoped to teach her, that her worth was not dependent on anyone's approval, not even families. The people who truly love you make room for you, and the ones who don't aren't worth shrinking yourself for. And just like that, the shadow of the wedding was gone, replaced by a new chapter built on self-respect and quiet strength. Looking back now, I realize that what happened with Olivia's wedding was never just about an invitation. It was about boundaries, self-worth, and the choices we make when faced with unfair treatment from the people we expect to protect us. For months, I thought the hurt was about Sophie missing one day. But in truth, it was about her seeing clearly who valued her and who didn't. And about me proving to her that when someone crosses a line, you have every right to stand firm. If I had caved to family pressure and gone to that wedding alone, the message to Sophie would have been devastating. It would have told her that her presence was optional, that her dignity could be traded for appearances. Instead, by walking away from an event that refused to make space for her, I showed her through action that she deserved better. It wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I had overreacted, if keeping us away had caused irreparable damage. There were days when family members still made pointed comments about how I ruined the wedding. But every time Sophie smiled with genuine confidence, every time she shared her art without hesitation, I knew I'd done the right thing. The Christmas album had been my gamble, my quiet way of breaking through Olivia's defenses without a shouting match. And it worked. It reminded her of the years before Ethan's influence, before social status began outweighing family connection. It reminded her who she was at her core. The aftermath wasn't a fairy tale. Olivia didn't suddenly become the perfect sister, and our family didn't magically return to the way it was. But there was progress, and sometimes progress is enough. Ethan still sends the occasional cold message through mutual relatives, but Olivia no longer parrots his dismissive tone. She comes to family dinners without him now, and Sophie is always greeted with warmth. Margaret remains distant, but that's her choice. We've stopped chasing approval from people determined not to give it. The bigger change was in me. I used to think being the bigger person meant keeping the peace at all costs, swallowing hurt feelings, and avoiding conflict even when something was wrong. Now I see it differently. Sometimes being the bigger person means drawing a hard line and holding it. It means saying, "I love you, but I will not accept this treatment," even if it makes you the villain in someone else's story for a while. Sophie learned that lesson too. A few weeks ago, she told me about a friend at school who had been excluding her from group projects. I told her to speak up, and she smiled. "Don't worry, Mom, I know how to handle it. If they can't make space for me, I'll make my own space. I don't need to beg to belong." Hearing that was the final confirmation that every uncomfortable decision I made had been worth it. That's why if there's anything I hope someone takes from our story, it's this: protecting the people you love sometimes means making choices others won't understand. It sometimes means being accused of drama or stubbornness or selfishness. But if those choices are rooted in love and respect, they can change everything. I think about the day Sophie stood in front of her painting at the gallery, wearing the dress she never got to wear to the wedding. And I see not just my daughter, but a young woman who knows her own worth. And I think about Olivia slowly coming back to herself, learning to rebuild without the approval of people who only value appearances. Family isn't defined by last names or shared bloodlines. It's defined by the people who show up for you, who make space for you, who love you without conditions. And sometimes it's defined by the ones who choose to come back when they've lost their way. The night of the gallery opening, as Sophie and I walked home under the streetlights, she slipped her hand into mine and said, "Mom, thanks for standing up for me." I smiled and squeezed her hand. "Always," I said. "That's what family means." And this time I knew she believed it completely.